Dragons. These fantastic creatures have captivated the mind of man. From Bahamut, which comes to us from the Middle East, to Tiamat from Babylonian mythology. There are the English wyverns, so common in medieval heraldry, and the tale of the Tarasque from France. Even in the modern era, the creature dominates popular culture. Tolkien brought Smaug to life in The Hobbit, and Sean Connery awed moviegoers as Draco in Dragonheart. It's easy to understand why most people brush these magnificent creatures off as simple fantasy. The existence of sentient reptiles that demand sacrifices and hoard gold is a pretty hard sell, I admit. But tales of dragons are old and global in scale. Aren't you the least bit curious as to where this all came from? Let's unroll the ancient scrolls, dust off those old tomes, and take a deeper dive into the dangerous domain of dragons. Welcome to Creation Connection. I'm Trey. Before we begin, here's your friendly reminder to like, subscribe, and ring that bell. Are you ready?
Yeah!
Let's go! History is littered with accounts of dragon-like creatures around the world. While the dragons we encounter today are all confined to movie screens or the pages of a book, some of the dragons of history are presented as real living creatures. Let's take a look at a few different examples. The Chinese Zodiac is old and complex. The astrological system dates back to at least the Shang dynasty in the 1700s BC, but could find its roots even further back than that. This methodology, once used by ancient soothsayers to predict future events, is still referenced in Asian cultures today. The story of the Chinese Zodiac varies depending on who tells it, but the legend goes that the Jade Emperor organized a grand race. The animals of the world were invited to partake, but only 12 species showed up. A pig, a dog, a rooster, a monkey, a sheep, a horse, a snake, a dragon, a rabbit, a tiger, an ox, and a rat. As a participation reward, each of these creatures would have a year named after them, and the race would determine the order of those years. According to the myth, the rat won. But what's more interesting is the selection of animals present. Why is it that the Chinese Zodiac has 11 animals that are clearly living today, and then the 12th is a dragon? Could it be that perhaps at the time this astrological system was developed, there were dragon-like creatures living in ancient China? Although there is some debate about the details, scholars agree that the Book of Job is truly ancient. This absolutely fascinating bit of scripture details the history of a man who would not curse God, even in the face of incredible suffering. The theological truths of this book are not to be ignored, but let's look at a few specific passages. Look now at the behemoth, which I made along with you. He eats grass like an ox. See now, his strength is in his hips, and his power is in his stomach muscles. He moves his tail like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are tightly knit. His bones are like beams of bronze, his ribs like bars of iron. He is the first of the ways of God. Only he who made him can bring near his sword. From this description, the behemoth is quite an impressive creature. In fact, it sounds rather monstrous with its bones of bronze and ribs of iron. Some scholars claim that this beast is a hippopotamus or perhaps an elephant. But do these beasts really evoke the sort of powerful imagery that the author of Job uses? I, for one, am skeptical.
That is sus.
But I'm no expert. Let's hear what Dr. Brian Thomas has to say about this.
God is talking to Job, appears to Job in a whirlwind, and he starts talking about all these animals: deer, ostrich, horses. These are regular animals. And then he gets to behemoth, and it's like, that's not in the zoo. What is that, So what is the behemoth? in the context of those regular animals, it makes the most sense to say, well, behemoth must have been some specific animal. In fact, it describes the animal with certain characteristics. People insist it must be a known animal today, but it doesn't match a known animal today, so maybe it's not an animal after all. And then we start to spiritualize it or allegorize it, and we ruin it that way. I think we can fix that problem by just pulling in the extinct animals. And we've looked at a lot of these, and we're convinced now, after having studied this for years, that some of the sauropod dinosaurs would have fit perfectly as a behemoth. See, the anatomy matches tail like a tree. I mean, what else had a tail like a tree than these dinosaurs? So all these subtle clues match the anatomy of, specifically, we think maybe one of the Diplodocus type. So we say diplodocid dinosaurs, because they were able to literally rear up on their hind legs, using their hip as a balance, like a fulcrum for a lever. This is crazy talk, right? Because those Diplodocus dinosaurs, they were buried 100 million years ago or more. I mean, so they're long gone, according to conventional mainstream thinking. But that's not biblical thinking, is it? In fact, if you have these creatures dying, millions of years before Adam and Eve sinned, then you place death before sin. And you also have the problem of original proteins still in these bones, which they wouldn't last that long. So to solve the protein problem and the death before sin problem, we just take all these fossils and slide them from their position on the evolutionary timeline of millions of years ago, just slide them up to Noah's flood. Noah's flood happened after sin, so it solves the death before sin problem by having these creatures die after sin. And then it also solves the protein problem by having, these creatures having been in the ground for only several thousand years since Noah's flood. And it also gives us a new option to fit the anatomy of behemoth. And so I think the behemoth was a sauropod dinosaur.
Intriguing. While behemoth is a Hebrew word, the creature mentioned could also easily fit the description of a dragon. Claudius Aelianus, more commonly known as Aelian, was a Roman author and teacher born in the latter part of the 2nd century AD. His mastery of the Greek language earned him the title of meleglottus. While that sounds like a disease more than anything, it actually means honey-tongued, which seems a bit more pleasant. Aelian's most influential work is De Natura Animalium, which translates to On the Nature of Animals. This series of 17 books recounts strange and wondrous tales of creatures and mankind's encounters with them. While some accounts are clearly mythical and references to the Greek pantheon litter the work, there are also narratives that accurately describe creatures we see and know today. Nestled deep within the pages of Book 17, we find the curious chronicle of a very famous figure from history, one Alexander the Great. While in India, Alexander encountered a great serpent in a cave. This serpent was considered sacred by the locals, and as such, they implored him to leave the creature alone. Alexander agreed, but his army still had to pass by the cave in which the creature lived. Let's see what our good friend Aelian has to say about this. Now, as the army passed by the cavern and caused a noise, the serpent was aware of it. It has, the sharpest hearing and the keenest sight of all animals. And it hissed and snorted so violently that all were terrified and confounded. It was reported to measure 70 cubits, although it was not visible in all its length, for it only put its head out. At any rate, its eyes are said to have been the size of a large, round Macedonian shield. That is impressive, to say the least. For reference, 70 cubits is about 105 feet, and a Macedonian shield would be about 2 feet in diameter. Should this description be taken as absolute truth? No, I would think not. There is likely a degree of exaggeration here. But still, Alexander's army encountered something rather draconic in India, and it left such an impression that it was still being written about several centuries later. While Marco Polo was most famous for getting lost in a swimming pool, he had several other accomplishments of note. Our friend Marco was a Venetian merchant and explorer that spent 17 years in China during the late 1200s. He wrote a book that chronicled his experiences there titled The Description of the World, later called The Travels of Marco Polo. The book was popular, but many of its readers took it as the fantasies of a man with a wild imagination. It came to be known as Il Milione, or The Million Lies. But even on his deathbed, Polo swore that his words were truth, stating, "I have not told half of what I saw." That's some serious commitment to a whole lot of lies. Except that in the centuries after his death, a great deal of what he claimed was verified. A man whose great literary works were thought to have been fiction were accurate. Good job, Mr. Polo. Now that we've established the fact that my main man Marco wasn't some sort of madman, let's dig into his writings. The Travels of Marco Polo is separated into 4 books, but we're going to look specifically at chapter 40 of book 2. Marco Polo writes of a province called Karazhan, in which he encountered huge serpents, the description of which is rather terrifying. The largest serpents were said to be nearly 30 feet long and 8 feet across. Their short front legs had 3 claws each, and their jaws, filled with large, sharp teeth, were large enough to swallow a man. He states that their whole appearance is so formidable that neither man nor any kind of animal can approach them without terror. He goes on to explain that the people of Karazhan would make traps for these creatures, kill them, and then eat them. The meat was considered a delicacy, and some of the beast's fluids were used for medicinal purposes. Now, I wasn't there, so I can't confirm it, but this creature sounds a lot like what we would call a dragon. What does all of this mean? The examples we've discussed here are only a handful of the ancient stories of dragons. History is full of these tales from all over the world, and I haven't even touched on the medieval period in Europe. In more recent centuries, the fossilized bones of strange reptilian creatures have been found buried in the earth. A young anatomist named Richard Owen grew fascinated with these creatures. And in 1841, he called them terrible lizards, which, when translated into Greek, gives us the word dinosaur. But if the nations of the world didn't have the word dinosaur until the 1840s, could it be that ancient civilizations used other words to describe their very real encounters with terrible lizards? These accounts of great serpents and dragons seem to imply just that. We know from Genesis 1 that dinosaurs, dragons, whatever you want to call them, were created on day 6 of the creation week and lived at the same time as people. In light of that truth, these portrayals of memorable encounters with dinosaur-like animals make a lot more sense. Thanks for watching Creation Connection. New episodes come out on Wednesdays. You can find a dragon's hoard of information at icr.org, and we have a number of resources on this topic in our store. A link is in the description. Make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video. And we'll see you next time on Creation Connection.
Back, foul beast, or taste my blade!